The cruelest thing about being invisible is that everyone assumes you deserve it. I learned that lesson on a rainy Thursday night, standing beneath the golden chandeliers of Bellamy House while balancing a silver tray that weighed far less than the exhaustion pressing against my shoulders. My name is Grace Walker. I was 26 years old, working 2 jobs, sleeping 4 hours on a good night, and convincing myself that tomorrow would finally be kinder than today. It never was. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath sheets of cold spring rain, headlights stretching across wet pavement like ribbons of liquid gold. Inside, wealthy guests laughed over glasses of imported champagne that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Their conversations drifted through the ballroom in polished voices about investment portfolios, vacation homes in Aspen, and charity galas designed to celebrate generosity without ever requiring inconvenience. I smiled because that was part of the uniform. Comfortable shoes. Black dress. Hair tied back. Smile no matter what. My feet ached from 10 straight hours on the floor, but the smile remained. It always did. "Excuse me," a sharp voice called before I could reach the next table. I turned toward a woman wearing enough diamonds to reflect every chandelier in the room. Her expression twisted before I even spoke. "I've been waiting 5 minutes. Does anyone here actually know how to do their job?" "I'm so sorry, ma'am," I said softly, setting another tray aside. "I'll refill your glass immediately." She looked me up and down as though I had personally offended the entire evening by existing. "People like you always have an excuse." Around us, conversation slowed. Heads turned. No one interrupted. No one offered a word. They simply watched. I had seen that look before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was dismissal. The quiet certainty that someone wearing a server's uniform didn't deserve dignity. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the champagne bottle. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was hunger. Maybe it was the memory of opening another overdue hospital bill for my mother's treatments before leaving for work that afternoon. A single drop splashed against the white tablecloth. Barely noticeable. But to her, it was proof of everything she already believed about me. She sighed dramatically, waving her hand as if brushing dust from expensive fabric. "Unbelievable. They really let anyone work here now." A few nervous chuckles escaped nearby tables. My face grew warm. I whispered another apology even though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for anymore. Existing, perhaps. Across the ballroom, I felt something change. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a silence that moved differently from every other silence in the room. My eyes lifted almost without permission. Near the floor-to-ceiling window stood a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, one hand resting lightly against a crystal glass he hadn't touched in several minutes. Tall. Calm. Dark hair brushed neatly away from a face carved with impossible restraint. He wasn't watching the gala. He was watching me. His expression revealed nothing, yet something about those steel-gray eyes unsettled me. Not because they looked dangerous. Because they looked like they had noticed what everyone else had already decided to ignore. Then, for the first time that entire evening, the man slowly set his untouched drink on the table and began walking in my direction. I froze as the man crossed the ballroom, not because he hurried, but because everyone else instinctively moved aside without being asked. Conversations faded into uncertain whispers. Waiters stepped back. Even the musicians seemed quieter, their melody swallowed by an invisible current that followed him wherever he walked. I had never seen anyone command a room without raising his voice. The woman who had spent the last several minutes reminding me how insignificant I was straightened her posture the moment she noticed him approaching. Her practiced smile returned so quickly it almost looked painful. "Mr. Romano," she said brightly. "What a wonderful surprise." He acknowledged her with nothing more than the slightest nod before his attention settled on me again. Up close, he looked older than I had first guessed, perhaps 34, with faint silver beginning to appear near his temples despite the dark hair brushed neatly back. His tailored charcoal suit fit perfectly, every detail understated, every movement deliberate. There was no expensive watch displayed for attention, no flashy jewelry demanding admiration. Somehow that made him seem even wealthier. More powerful. His calm felt earned. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. His voice was low and steady, carrying just far enough for everyone nearby to hear. The woman laughed lightly. "Nothing important. Just a careless mistake." I lowered my eyes immediately. "It was my fault," I said. "I am very sorry." He did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at the small drop of champagne on the white tablecloth, then at the untouched glasses surrounding it. Finally, he looked back at me. "That is what everyone is upset about?" he asked quietly. No one spoke. The silence stretched several long seconds before he reached for the glass I had just poured. He lifted it, took one measured sip, and placed it back exactly where it had been. "Tastes perfectly fine." His words were simple. Nothing dramatic. Yet the atmosphere changed completely. The woman forced another smile. "Of course. I simply expected better service." "Perhaps," he replied calmly, "we should expect better kindness." I felt my heartbeat stumble. No one had defended me in a very long time. Certainly not a stranger. Especially not in a room filled with people who measured human worth by bank accounts and designer labels. Without another word, he turned toward me. "What is your name?" "Grace," I answered after a moment. "Grace Walker." "Thank you for your work tonight, Miss Walker." It sounded strangely sincere. As though serving food for 12 exhausting hours deserved gratitude instead of criticism. He gave one final nod before walking away toward the private dining room at the back of the ballroom. The crowd slowly returned to their conversations, but something had shifted. Nobody looked at me with open ridicule anymore. They looked confused. Curious. I finished the rest of my shift in silence, replaying that brief conversation over and over while collecting empty plates and polishing forgotten glasses. Near midnight, I changed into my faded blue jacket, clocked out, and stepped into the cold rain. The city smelled of wet pavement, gasoline, and fresh coffee drifting from a corner deli that never seemed to close. My old Honda sedan started on the second try, just like always. 20 minutes later I parked outside the small brick apartment building where my mother waited on the third floor. The hallway lights flickered as I climbed the stairs carrying a paper bag filled with discounted sandwiches from the event. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could, but she was already awake, wrapped in a blanket on the couch with a book resting unopened in her lap. "Long night?" she asked with a tired smile. I smiled back, hiding everything else behind it. "Not as long as tomorrow will be." The alarm rang at 5:30 the next morning, long before the sun climbed above the Manhattan skyline. My body protested every movement as I slipped quietly from the worn sofa where I had fallen asleep after making sure my mother had taken her medication. She insisted she could still manage on her own, but the slow tremble in her hands every morning told a different story. I brewed the cheapest coffee I could find at the grocery store, packed her breakfast beside neatly labeled pill bottles, and kissed her forehead before heading back into the cool morning air. County Mercy Hospital stood only 15 minutes away, but those 15 minutes always felt like crossing into another world. Sirens echoed somewhere in the distance. Delivery trucks unloaded fresh produce for restaurants that would later serve people whose lives barely resembled mine. The smell of fresh bagels drifted from a bakery while commuters hurried past with expensive briefcases and expressions that never slowed long enough to notice anyone around them. By 7 o'clock I was already changing bandages, checking vital signs, and reassuring frightened patients that everything would be all right even when I was not entirely sure it would be. Caring for people was the only part of my life that never felt heavy. It reminded me that kindness still existed, even if it often arrived quietly. Around noon I finally stepped into the staff lounge carrying a cup of lukewarm coffee. My friend Emily looked up from her phone the moment I walked in. "Grace, were you at Bellamy House last night?" she asked. I nodded. "Another charity event." She turned the screen toward me. A business magazine displayed a photograph taken only hours earlier. Standing beneath the ballroom lights was the same man who had thanked me by name. Damian Romano. The headline called him one of New York's most influential entrepreneurs, a quiet investor with interests in shipping, real estate, luxury hotels, and international logistics. The article praised his charitable foundation for donating millions to children's hospitals and community programs while mentioning almost nothing about his private life. "People say nobody really knows him," Emily whispered. "He almost never gives interviews." I studied the photograph longer than I should have. The camera captured the same calm expression I remembered from the night before. Reserved. Controlled. Impossible to read. Nothing about him suggested the kind of man who would stop an entire ballroom simply to defend a waitress he had never met. I folded the magazine closed and returned it to her. "He was just being polite," I said. Emily laughed softly. "Men like Damian Romano are never just anything." Before I could answer, my pager buzzed. Room 412 needed assistance. The afternoon disappeared into medication rounds, paperwork, worried families, and endless footsteps echoing across polished hospital floors. By the time my shift finally ended, the sky had turned gray again, threatening another spring storm. I walked toward the employee parking lot, searching my bag for my car keys while mentally calculating whether I could stretch this week's paycheck far enough to cover rent, groceries, and my mother's next prescription refill. That was when I noticed a familiar black sedan parked across the street. Its engine idled quietly. The windows were tinted dark enough that I could not see inside, yet something about it made me stop walking. A second later, the rear passenger door opened. Damian Romano stepped onto the sidewalk, adjusted the cuff of his charcoal coat, and looked directly at me with the same calm expression that had followed me ever since Bellamy House. "Miss Walker," he said gently. "I hope I am not interrupting your evening, but I was wondering if you would allow me 5 minutes of your time." I looked behind me before answering, half expecting him to be speaking to someone else. The employee parking lot was nearly empty except for a few nurses climbing into aging sedans and a maintenance worker pushing a supply cart toward the loading dock. There was no one else nearby. His attention remained fixed on me with quiet patience, as though he had all the time in the world. 5 minutes? I repeated cautiously. "That is all I am asking," he replied. His voice carried the same calm certainty I remembered from the ballroom, never demanding, never hurried. I tightened my grip on my canvas bag. Every sensible instinct told me not to walk toward a man I barely knew, no matter how polite he seemed. Yet every memory of the previous evening reminded me that he had been the only person willing to treat me like I mattered. I stopped a few feet away, leaving enough distance to feel comfortable. "All right," I said. 5 minutes. The faintest smile touched the corner of his mouth before disappearing almost immediately. "Thank you." Rain began falling again, light enough to shimmer beneath the parking lot lights without soaking the pavement. He glanced toward the hospital entrance before looking back at me. "I wanted to apologize if my appearance here made you uncomfortable." I blinked in surprise. "You came here to apologize?" People in my position are often misunderstood when they appear unexpectedly. "And what position is that?" He looked toward the skyline for a brief moment. "One that attracts attention I do not always welcome." It was an honest answer without actually answering anything. I almost smiled. "You are very good at avoiding questions." "So I have been told." For the first time since meeting him, I laughed quietly. It surprised both of us. The sound felt unfamiliar after so many difficult months. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "That is better," he said. "You should laugh more often." Before I could respond, my phone vibrated inside my jacket. It was my mother calling. I answered immediately. "Mom? Is everything all right?" Her gentle voice sounded weaker than usual. "I am sorry, sweetheart. I did not mean to interrupt. I just wanted to remind you not to forget dinner." "I will be home soon," I promised. "Did you take your afternoon medication?" Yes. Do not worry about me. We exchanged a few more reassuring words before I ended the call. When I looked up, Damien had quietly stepped farther back, giving me privacy without my having to ask. The simple gesture caught me off guard. Most people either ignored boundaries or made a performance of respecting them. He simply understood. Your mother? He asked after I slipped the phone away. I nodded. She has been ill for a while. He did not ask what illness. He did not offer sympathy that sounded rehearsed. Instead, his eyes drifted toward my hands as I adjusted the strap of my bag. My sleeve slid back just enough to reveal faint reddish marks left by carrying heavy medical equipment throughout the day. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. You work too hard, he said quietly. I instinctively pulled my sleeve down. I am fine. His gaze remained steady, never accusing, never intrusive. Miss Walker, he said with genuine concern, the world has convinced many good people to say those words even when they are exhausted. I looked away toward the rain collecting beneath the streetlights because suddenly it felt easier than meeting his eyes. Sometimes being fine is simply the most affordable option. For several long seconds neither of us spoke. Then a black umbrella appeared above us. I had not even noticed one of his drivers approaching until the rain no longer touched my shoulders. Damien accepted the umbrella with a grateful nod but held it so that it sheltered me more than himself. I hope you will forgive one final question, he said softly. Would you allow me the opportunity to help if you ever found yourself carrying more than one person should have to carry alone? His question lingered in the cool evening air long after the rain had begun to fade. I searched his face for hidden motives, for the kind of calculated expression I had learned to expect whenever someone offered help. Too often kindness arrived carrying invisible conditions. Too often generosity became another kind of debt. But Damien Romano simply waited. He did not step closer. He did not pressure me. He allowed the silence to exist without trying to fill it. That is very thoughtful, I finally said. But I have managed this long on my own. He nodded once, almost as though he had expected that answer. I believe you have. There was something strangely comforting about hearing someone acknowledge my strength instead of questioning it. Most people either pitied me or dismissed me. He did neither. Then why ask? I wondered aloud. Because surviving alone is not the same as living well. His words settled somewhere deep inside me, somewhere I had carefully avoided looking for years. Before I could respond, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a simple cream-colored business card. There was no flashy logo, no list of impressive titles, only his name, a direct phone number, and a single embossed crest that I did not recognize. He held it toward me without insisting that I take it. Keep it, he said. You never have to use it. But if life becomes heavier than it should be, call me. I hesitated before accepting the card. The paper felt surprisingly thick between my fingers, expensive without trying to appear expensive. Why me? I asked quietly. You do not even know me. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. Sometimes 5 minutes tells you more about a person than 5 years. The statement should have sounded impossible, yet somehow it did not. A car passed along the wet street, its headlights briefly illuminating the raindrops still clinging to the umbrella above us. Somewhere across the avenue a church bell marked 6 o'clock. I realized our 5 minutes had long since passed. I should go, I said. My mother will worry. Of course. He stepped aside immediately, clearing the sidewalk as though he never intended to stand in my way. I offered a small smile before walking toward my old Honda. Halfway there I turned back. He was still standing beneath the umbrella, watching only long enough to make sure I reached my car safely. The moment I closed the driver's door, he nodded once and disappeared into the waiting sedan. The following week settled back into familiar routines. Morning hospital shifts blended into evening catering jobs, grocery lists, prescription refills, and unpaid bills spread across my kitchen table after midnight. I slipped Damien's business card into my wallet without really thinking about it, telling myself it was only because throwing it away felt rude. I never intended to call. Then, 3 days later, I arrived home to find my mother sitting quietly beside the apartment window with an unopened envelope resting in her lap. Her gentle smile could not hide the worry in her eyes. "It came while you were working," she said softly. I opened the envelope and felt my stomach tighten. The building had been sold to a new owner. Every tenant had 60 days to move unless they agreed to a rent increase that was nearly double what we were already struggling to pay. I read the notice twice, hoping I had misunderstood the numbers. I had not. My mother reached across the small kitchen table and squeezed my hand. "We will figure something out." I wanted to believe her. Instead, I stared through the rain-speckled window toward the city lights, wondering how many more pieces of ordinary life could disappear before there was nothing left to hold together. As I reached into my wallet to pay for a pizza flyer that had slipped inside by mistake, a cream-colored business card quietly slid onto the table and came to rest beside the eviction notice. I stared at the business card until the embossed letters blurred together. Damien Romano. Just a name. Just a phone number. Yet somehow it felt heavier than the eviction notice lying beside it. My mother reached across the table and gently slid the card back toward me. "The gentleman from the charity event?" she asked. I nodded. I had told her about him a few nights earlier, although I had carefully left out how deeply his words had stayed with me. She smiled with the quiet wisdom that only difficult years seem to teach. "Sometimes people arrive in our lives for a reason, Grace." I folded the card and returned it to my wallet. "Or sometimes they are simply being polite." She did not argue. She simply squeezed my hand before standing to prepare tea, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The next morning began like every other. Coffee that had cooled before I finished half the cup. A crowded subway. 12 patients waiting before my shift officially started. I buried myself in work because helping other people was easier than thinking about losing our home. Every smile I offered a patient felt genuine. Every reassuring word felt real. The only thing I could not seem to comfort was myself. 3 days passed. I ignored the business card. I searched apartment listings during lunch breaks, only to discover that every place within our budget had already been rented or was far beyond what I could afford. I picked up an extra catering shift for Saturday night, hoping the additional income might somehow solve a problem that simple arithmetic insisted could not be solved. By the time Saturday arrived, my legs already felt like they had worked an entire week. The event took place at another luxury hotel overlooking Central Park. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished marble floors while guests celebrated a real estate award ceremony that seemed impossibly distant from the reality waiting for me at home. I moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses and collecting empty plates, trying to become invisible again. Invisible people rarely attracted trouble. Near the end of the evening, my manager hurried toward me with an anxious expression. "Grace, table 14 wants another bottle immediately." I nodded and reached for the requested vintage. As I turned, a sharply dressed man accidentally stepped backward into my path. The unopened bottle slipped from my hands and landed on the thick carpet with a dull thud before rolling harmlessly beneath a nearby chair. Silence spread across the room. The bottle had not broken, but several guests looked over anyway. Before I could bend down to retrieve it, the man frowned impatiently. "You should pay more attention," he said loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. Heat rushed into my face. "I am sorry," I answered automatically. "It was an accident." He shook his head with obvious annoyance. "Accidents become expensive." My manager appeared almost instantly, apologizing over and over before I even had the chance to speak again. I could feel dozens of unfamiliar eyes settling on me, and for one painful moment I was back at Bellamy House, standing beneath another chandelier while strangers silently decided what kind of person I must be. Then another voice entered the conversation. Calm. Familiar. Impossible to mistake. "Interesting," Damien Romano said as he stepped away from a nearby table where I had not even noticed him sitting. The bottle survived the fall, yet kindness seems far more fragile this evening. Every head turned toward him. The room became so still that I could hear the soft notes of the piano drifting from the far corner of the ballroom. Damien looked first at the unopened bottle, then at me, before offering the smallest reassuring nod. Somehow, with that single glance, I remembered exactly where I had placed his business card, and for the first time since we met, I wondered if perhaps accepting help did not always mean surrendering my dignity. The gentleman who had complained a moment earlier forced a polite smile the instant he recognized Damien Romano. It was remarkable how quickly confidence could dissolve when confronted by someone who never needed to raise his voice. "Mr. Romano," he said, smoothing the front of his tailored jacket. "I did not realize you were here." Damien regarded him with the same composed expression that never seemed to change. "Clearly." His answer was quiet, almost conversational, yet it carried through the ballroom with surprising clarity. My manager stood frozen beside me, still apologizing under his breath while I carefully picked up the unopened bottle from the carpet. Not a single drop had spilled. Damien glanced toward the bottle before looking back at the guest. "Nothing was damaged," he observed. "Except perhaps someone's evening." The man gave a nervous laugh. "I simply expect professional service." "As do I," Damien replied. "Professional service deserves professional respect." Silence settled over the nearby tables. Even the waitstaff had paused just enough to notice what would happen next. Damien turned slightly toward my manager. "May I ask her name?" My manager straightened immediately. "Grace Walker, sir. She is one of our hardest workers." "I already know Miss Walker," Damien answered calmly. "Then you also know she is usually very reliable," my manager added quickly. Damien nodded once. "I do." There was no anger in his voice. No accusation. Only certainty. Somehow that certainty seemed more powerful than any argument could have been. The guest cleared his throat. "Perhaps I overreacted." Damien offered the faintest smile. Recognizing that is often the beginning of good character. The conversation ended there. No humiliation. No public lecture. No dramatic confrontation. Simply a few measured sentences that somehow restored my dignity without taking anyone else's away. The ballroom gradually returned to its conversations, but the atmosphere felt different. Lighter. My manager quietly touched my shoulder. "Grace, take 5 minutes." I blinked in surprise. Breaks during events were almost unheard of. "Thank you," I whispered. I stepped onto the outdoor terrace overlooking Central Park. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city washed clean beneath thousands of lights. Cool air filled my lungs as I rested both hands against the stone railing. I had not realized how tightly I had been holding my breath until that moment. The glass door opened softly behind me. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. Damien stopped several feet away, giving me the same respectful distance he always seemed to understand without explanation. "You handled that well," he said. I laughed quietly, though there was little humor in it. "Standing still has become one of my better skills." "No," he answered. "Remaining kind after disappointment is much harder than standing still." I looked out across the city instead of meeting his eyes. "Kindness does not pay rent." "No," he admitted. "But it builds something money never can." I thought about my mother waiting at home, the eviction notice folded inside our kitchen drawer, and the stack of unpaid bills hidden beneath it. Sometimes I wonder if being good simply makes life harder. He was silent for several moments before answering. "The world often rewards the loudest people first. It remembers the kindest people last. That does not mean kindness loses." His words settled over the quiet terrace like the last drops of rain slipping from the edge of the roof. Before I could respond, one of his associates stepped outside and approached with careful urgency. "Sir," the man said respectfully, "the meeting is ready." Damien acknowledged him with a brief nod but did not leave immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and placed a small sealed envelope on the stone railing beside me. Do not open it now, he said gently. Open it when you are home with your mother. I looked down at the plain envelope, then back at him. What is it? His expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. Not charity, Miss Walker. Just an opportunity. The decision will always be yours. I kept the envelope in my apron pocket through the rest of the evening, resisting the temptation to open it every time my fingers brushed against its smooth edges. It was surprisingly light, yet somehow it felt heavier than every tray I carried that night. My shift finally ended just after 11:30. The city had grown quiet beneath a blanket of low clouds, and cool air drifted through the nearly empty streets as I drove home with the radio turned off. My thoughts were loud enough. My mother was still awake when I walked into our apartment. She looked up from the old quilt she had been sewing and smiled with the familiar warmth that had carried both of us through years of uncertainty. Long evening? She asked. A little unusual, I admitted, placing my keys beside the fruit bowl on our tiny kitchen counter. Her eyes immediately noticed the envelope still resting in my hand. Is that from him? I nodded. He asked me not to open it until I was home. She poured 2 cups of chamomile tea before sitting beside me at the small wooden table that had belonged to my grandparents. For several quiet moments neither of us spoke. Finally, I slid one finger beneath the seal and carefully unfolded the single sheet inside. There was no contract. No legal paperwork. No hidden conditions. Only one page, neatly typed, accompanied by a handwritten note. The printed letter explained that the Romano Community Foundation was expanding a patient assistance program at County Mercy Hospital. They were seeking experienced nursing staff to help coordinate care for low-income families facing long-term medical treatment. The salary listed at the bottom was nearly twice what I earned working 2 jobs. Full health insurance. Flexible scheduling. Educational support for advanced certifications. I read every line twice before noticing the handwritten message beneath it. Miss Walker, kindness is a rare qualification. Skills can be taught. Character cannot. If this opportunity interests you, the position is yours. If it does not, I sincerely hope another door opens for you soon. No obligation. No expectation. Damian Romano. I stared at the note until my eyes blurred. This cannot be real, I whispered. My mother gently took the paper and adjusted her glasses before reading it herself. Tears slowly gathered in the corners of her eyes, though her smile never disappeared. Grace, she said softly, do you realize what this means? I did. 1 job instead of 2. Evenings at home instead of banquet halls. Time to eat dinner with my mother while it was still warm. Time to sleep. Time to breathe. Yet something held me back. Why would he do this for someone he barely knows? My mother folded the letter with careful hands. Maybe because he knows exactly who you are. I looked at her, confused. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Not your resume. Not your paycheck. Not your apartment. He sees your heart. I wanted to believe that. I truly did. But life had taught me to question every unexpected blessing. The next morning, before my hospital shift began, I stopped at the nurse's station where Emily was organizing patient charts. I quietly handed her the letter. She read it in complete silence before looking at me with wide eyes. Grace, she whispered, do you know how many people would do anything for an opportunity like this? That is exactly what worries me. She tilted her head. You think there is a catch? I looked through the hallway window toward patients waiting patiently for care. I think people this powerful rarely do something for nothing. Emily carefully folded the letter and returned it to me. Maybe, she said. Or maybe you finally met someone whose power did not change his character. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated with an incoming news alert. The headline filled the screen in bold letters. Business leader Damian Romano denies rumors linking him to New York's most secretive criminal empire. My heartbeat slowed as I read the words again. Suddenly every whispered conversation, every silent room, every respectful glance from strangers, and every unanswered question surrounding Damien Romano took on an entirely different meaning. I could have ignored the headline. I could have folded my phone shut, accepted the position, and pretended the rumors belonged to someone else's story. Instead, I spent the entire afternoon thinking about the man who had quietly defended a waitress twice without asking for anything in return. Every patient I greeted reminded me of his handwritten words. Kindness is a rare qualification. By the end of my shift, I still had not decided whether to believe the newspapers or my own experience. News reports were filled with anonymous sources and carefully chosen speculation. My memories contained only simple moments. A respectful conversation in the rain. A patient smile. An opportunity offered without pressure. Those things were harder to dismiss. 2 evenings later I finally dialed the number printed on Damien's business card. My heart pounded so loudly I almost ended the call before anyone answered. A calm female voice greeted me after the second ring. "Mr. Romano's office." "My name is Grace Walker," I said. "He gave me a card a few weeks ago." There was a brief pause. "One moment, Miss Walker." I expected to be transferred through assistants or asked to leave a message. Instead, his familiar voice came on the line less than 10 seconds later. "Good evening, Miss Walker." He sounded as though he had been expecting my call all along. "I hope I am not interrupting." "Not at all." I took a slow breath. "I received your letter. I hoped you would." I looked through the hospital window toward the parking lot where sunset painted long shadows across the asphalt. "May I ask you something honestly?" "Always." "Why me?" Silence filled the line for several seconds. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. "Would you be willing to meet me tomorrow afternoon?" he asked. There are some answers that deserve more respect than a telephone conversation. Every sensible instinct warned me to decline. Yet curiosity quietly overcame caution. "All right," I answered. "One conversation." "One conversation," he agreed. The following afternoon I expected another luxury hotel or private office. Instead, the driver who greeted me outside the hospital brought me to a modest community center on the Lower East Side. Children laughed on a basketball court behind the building while volunteers carried boxes of donated groceries through the front entrance. There were no photographers. No reporters. No grand opening ceremony. Just ordinary people helping other ordinary people. Damien stood near the food pantry wearing a navy sweater instead of one of his tailored suits. He was helping an elderly volunteer arrange canned goods onto shelves. When he noticed me, he finished carrying the last box before walking over with the same calm smile I had begun to recognize. "Thank you for coming." I looked around in confusion. "This belongs to your foundation?" He nodded. "One of several." Before I could ask another question, a little girl ran across the room holding a drawing made with bright crayons. "Mr. Damien," she called happily. I finished it. He accepted the picture with genuine excitement, kneeling to thank her at eye level before carefully folding the drawing and slipping it into his jacket pocket as though it were priceless. The little girl hugged him without hesitation before running back toward her grandmother. I watched the entire exchange in silence. It was impossible to fake that kind of trust. Damien noticed my expression but said nothing. Instead, he led me toward a quiet office overlooking the activity downstairs. On the wall hung photographs of scholarship recipients, hospital wings, youth programs, and neighborhood gardens funded over many years. As I studied the pictures, my eyes settled on a framed newspaper clipping tucked discreetly into one corner. The headline praised the Romano Community Foundation, but someone had written across the margin in black ink many years earlier. "Power means nothing if the people beside you are still afraid." I turned slowly toward Damien. Before I could ask about the handwritten words, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen only once, and for the first time since I had met him, the calm in his eyes gave way to unmistakable concern. He silenced the phone without answering immediately, but I noticed the subtle change in his posture. His shoulders remained relaxed, yet his attention shifted somewhere far beyond the walls of the community center. For several seconds he stared through the office window at the volunteers below, as though weighing two responsibilities that mattered equally. Finally, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and offered me an apologetic smile. "I am sorry," he said. "Some decisions cannot wait. Others deserve not to be rushed." I nodded. "You should take care of whatever you need." Instead of leaving, he motioned toward two chairs beside the window. "This conversation is what I need to take care of." We sat facing each other while the laughter of children drifted faintly upstairs. It was difficult to reconcile the quiet man across from me with the headlines that had filled my phone only days earlier. He noticed my hesitation before I spoke. "You read the articles," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." He leaned back slightly, his expression calm. "And now you are trying to decide which version of me is real." I lowered my eyes for a moment. "I do not like judging people by rumors." "But you cannot ignore them either." "No." He nodded with quiet understanding. "Neither would I." Another brief silence settled between us before he folded his hands together. "Grace, influence creates stories. Some are earned. Some are invented. I have learned that correcting every rumor leaves very little time for doing actual good." I studied his face carefully. He did not sound defensive. He sounded tired. "So you are not going to explain everything?" I asked. A faint smile appeared. "If I spent my life explaining myself, I would never have time to become the man I hope to be." His answer should have frustrated me. Instead, it felt strangely honest. At that moment an elderly volunteer gently knocked on the office door. "Mr. Romano," she said warmly, "the new refrigeration unit arrived this morning. We wanted to thank you before the food distribution begins tomorrow." Damien immediately stood and walked with her into the hallway. Curious, I followed a few steps behind. Nearly every volunteer greeted him by his first name. Nobody bowed. Nobody acted afraid. One older gentleman insisted on showing him a repaired wheelchair ramp outside the entrance. A young mother introduced him to her newborn son. Damien listened to each person with complete attention, never glancing at his watch, never acting rushed despite the phone call that still lingered unanswered in his pocket. Watching him move through the center felt less like observing an executive and more like watching a neighbor who remembered everyone's story. After nearly 20 minutes he returned carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to me before we stepped onto the quiet front porch overlooking the basketball court. "I have another question," I admitted. "Ask anything." I wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "If you have the resources to live anywhere in the city, why spend your afternoon here?" He watched a teenage volunteer helping an elderly man carry groceries to his car before answering. "Because this neighborhood remembered me when nobody else did." I turned toward him. "You grew up here?" He nodded slowly. "My mother worked 2 jobs. We relied on places like this more than once." I blinked in surprise. That single sentence explained more than any newspaper article ever had. Suddenly the handwritten note beneath the scholarship photographs made perfect sense. Power means nothing if the people beside you are still afraid. Before either of us could continue, his phone rang again. This time he answered immediately. He listened without interrupting, his expression remaining composed until he quietly said, "Make sure everyone is safe. I will handle the rest when I arrive." He ended the call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and looked at me with unmistakable sincerity. "Grace, I promised you honesty. So let me begin with this. There is a part of my life that attracts attention I never wanted for the people around me, and if you choose to walk away now, I will respect that decision completely." I looked at him for a long moment, searching for fear inside myself and finding something entirely different. Curiosity. Compassion. Perhaps even trust beginning to take shape before I was ready to admit it. You keep giving me opportunities to leave, I said quietly. Most people would spend their time convincing me to stay. Damien smiled faintly. A decision made freely is the only one worth respecting. The afternoon sun slipped lower across the neighborhood, casting long golden shadows over the basketball court where children were still laughing as though the world had never taught them disappointment. I watched them for a moment before turning back toward him. I have spent my entire life around people who judged others by appearances, I said. I promised myself I would not become one of them. Something softened in his expression. It was not relief exactly. It was gratitude. The kind that rarely needed words. Thank you, he replied. Although I should warn you, my life is rarely as peaceful as this place. I smiled gently. Neither is mine. We stood together in comfortable silence until one of the foundation volunteers called my name from inside the building. A middle-aged nurse wearing a Romano Community Foundation badge approached with a folder in her hands. Miss Walker, she said warmly, Mr. Romano asked us to prepare this only if you decided to visit. She handed me the folder before excusing herself. Inside were documents describing the patient assistance program, orientation schedules, continuing education opportunities, and partnerships with hospitals across New York. Every page reflected careful planning. Nothing appeared rushed or improvised. It became obvious that the offer had never been a favor created overnight. Someone had invested time into building something that could genuinely help people. You planned all this before you even knew whether I would accept, I observed. Damien looked toward the volunteers stocking shelves inside the building. Hope is easier to build before it is needed. I slowly closed the folder. You really believe I belong here? I believe people who spend their lives lifting others deserve someone willing to lift them once in a while. Those words settled deep inside me. No compliment about intelligence or beauty had ever touched me the way that simple sentence did. Before I could answer, an elderly woman slowly crossed the parking lot with the help of a walker. Damien noticed her immediately and walked over without hesitation. He carried her grocery bags to her car while listening patiently as she told him about her grandson's college graduation. She laughed halfway through the story and gently patted his arm. Your mother would be proud of you, she said. For the first time since meeting him, I saw genuine emotion pass across his face. It appeared only briefly before he thanked her quietly and wished her a safe drive home. As he walked back toward me, I realized there were moments when the carefully composed businessman disappeared completely, revealing someone who still carried memories he never spoke about. You miss her, I said softly. He stopped beside me and looked toward the evening sky. Every day. His voice was almost a whisper. She taught me that money can solve problems, but dignity heals people. He took a slow breath before continuing. When she became ill, there were strangers who helped us without asking for anything in return. I never learned all their names. Building these centers became my way of thanking people I could never thank personally. Suddenly everything fit together. The handwritten note. The community center. The scholarships. The patience he showed every stranger. He was not trying to rescue me because I was helpless. He was honoring someone who had once rescued his family with simple acts of kindness. As we began walking toward the parking lot, my phone rang. It was my mother. I answered immediately, expecting our usual conversation. Instead, her voice carried an excitement I had not heard in months. Grace, she said through happy tears, someone from the apartment office just called. They said our eviction notice has been withdrawn because an anonymous donor purchased the entire building and promised that every current resident could stay under the same lease terms. They would not tell me who it was, but sweetheart. Whoever they are, they just gave us our home back. My mother continued speaking through happy tears, but for several seconds I could not answer. I simply stood there beneath the fading evening sky while the words echoed inside my mind. We could stay. We would not lose the apartment that had held every memory of my family. We would not have to pack our lives into cardboard boxes. We would not have to begin again somewhere unfamiliar. Grace, my mother asked gently. Are you still there? I swallowed the emotion tightening my throat. Yes, Mom. I am here. Whoever did this, she whispered, I hope they know they gave more than a place to live. I hope so too. After promising I would be home soon, I ended the call and slowly lowered my phone. Damien had not asked a single question while I was speaking. He simply waited with the same quiet patience he had shown from the beginning. I looked directly at him. You already know, do not you? He held my gaze for a long moment before answering. I know your family is no longer in danger of losing its home. I smiled through eyes that refused to stay dry. Was it you? He did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the community center where volunteers were locking the doors after another long day of serving families who needed hope as much as groceries. Finally, he spoke. A group of investors purchased the building this morning. The agreement required that every resident keep their current lease. You are avoiding the question again. A faint smile crossed his face. Perhaps. I shook my head with quiet disbelief. Why would anyone do something that generous without asking for recognition? He folded his hands into the pockets of his coat as a cool evening breeze carried the scent of fresh rain across the street. Because when my mother needed help years ago, nobody stood in front of a camera afterward. They simply made sure we had another tomorrow. I felt every carefully built wall inside me begin to disappear. All my life I had believed that power always demanded attention, that generosity expected applause, that influence came with conditions. Standing beside Damien, I was discovering another possibility. The strongest people sometimes worked hardest to remain unseen. I cannot repay you, I whispered. He looked almost surprised by the sentence. Grace, I never wanted repayment. Then what do you want? He smiled, not with triumph or expectation, but with quiet sincerity. Accept the position. Continue caring for people the way you already do. Someday, when life gives you the opportunity to lift someone else, do the same. That is how kindness survives. Those words settled deep inside me. They felt less like advice and more like a promise passed carefully from one life to another. A black sedan quietly pulled up beside the curb. One of Damien's associates stepped out and respectfully opened the rear passenger door without interrupting our conversation. Damien glanced toward the waiting car before looking back at me. There are responsibilities I cannot postpone any longer. I nodded. I understand. He extended his hand, not as a businessman closing an agreement, but as one person placing complete trust in another. I accepted it. His handshake was steady, warm, and unexpectedly ordinary. Congratulations, Miss Walker, he said softly. You earned every opportunity waiting ahead of you long before we met. I laughed quietly. You still believe that? More than ever. As he released my hand, the little girl from the community center ran outside carrying another colorful drawing. Mr. Damien, she called happily. Do not forget this one. He accepted the picture with genuine gratitude before carefully placing it beside the first drawing inside his coat. Then he entered the waiting sedan. The car disappeared into the evening traffic without flashing lights or unnecessary attention, leaving only the quiet sound of children laughing behind me. I stood there for several more minutes, holding the folder he had given me, realizing that for the first time in many years, tomorrow no longer felt like something I had to survive. It felt like something I could finally look forward to. 6 months passed more quietly than I ever imagined possible. For the first time since I was a teenager, my evenings belonged to something other than exhaustion. I accepted the position with the Romano Community Foundation, and every morning I walked through the doors of County Mercy Hospital knowing I could give my patients my full attention instead of counting the hours until my second job began. My mother grew stronger with every passing week. Her laughter returned to our apartment before the flowers on our windowsill bloomed again. Some evenings we cooked dinner together while old jazz records played softly from the radio. Ordinary moments became extraordinary because we finally had time to notice them. I often visited the community center after work, helping families navigate medical appointments, insurance paperwork, and the confusing maze that illness so often creates. Every time I watched a frightened parent leave with hope instead of despair, I remembered the woman I used to be. The woman who believed surviving was the same thing as living. Damien and I saw each other often, though rarely in the glamorous places newspapers liked to imagine. Most of our conversations happened while carrying donated food boxes, organizing health fairs, or walking through neighborhoods where children still waved the moment they recognized his car. The headlines never changed. Reporters continued writing stories about rumors, influence, and unanswered questions. I stopped reading them. I had learned that spending enough time with someone reveals truths no headline ever could. One autumn afternoon, the foundation celebrated the opening of a new family wellness clinic connected to the hospital. It was not a grand ceremony. There were no celebrities. Only nurses, volunteers, teachers, construction workers, patients, and families who had helped build the project together. My mother stood proudly in the front row wearing the blue dress she had been saving for a special occasion. When the ribbon was finally cut, a little girl walked up to me carrying a drawing made with bright crayons. She smiled shyly before handing it over. In the picture, two people stood beneath a large umbrella while rain fell all around them. Above them she had carefully written, "Kind people help other people smile again." I laughed softly because I knew exactly where she had found that idea. Across the courtyard, Damien noticed the drawing and smiled without saying a word. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and volunteers stacked the last folding chairs, we stood together outside the clinic watching the city lights appear one by one. "Do you ever regret choosing this life?" I asked quietly. He considered the question for a moment before shaking his head. "Every difficult road I walked brought me here." He looked toward the entrance where my mother was laughing with several nurses before turning back to me. "And you?" I thought about the frightened waitress who had apologized for existing beneath glittering chandeliers only months before. She felt like someone I had once known rather than someone I still was. "I used to believe the world decided what I was worth," I answered. "Now I know that the right people simply remind you of the value you already had." He smiled, and neither of us needed to say anything more. As the first stars appeared above the Manhattan skyline, I realized love had never arrived in my life as a grand declaration or a fairy tale. It arrived as respect when I expected judgment, as quiet protection when I felt forgotten, and as hope when I had almost stopped believing tomorrow could be different. Society may have measured me by my uniform, my paycheck, and my circumstances, but one person's kindness taught me a truth I will carry for the rest of my life. The world changes whenever someone with the power to look away chooses instead to see another human being.